simulation gaming in general. So my history uh, with games and in general, really war games, I guess in particular, goes back to the early 70s. My first game was of this ilk was Richthofen's War from Avalon Hill. I played a lot of diplomacy all through middle school. Um, my first game convention was Origins, 1978 or 79. I believe it was the third Origins in Chester, Pennsylvania. And that was where I got to pick up the guy was just selling this game that turned out to be Junta. For those of you that are familiar, that's a really fascinating kind of classic simulation of sorts of a banana republic that actually does things in a real interesting way. So so my history with war games goes way back. And then in college I got into the more serious heavy war games, played a lot of things like Third Reich and Europa series and stuff like that. So I think it's instructive to kind of look at the past of war games and kind of how that informs a little bit of the future and where things are going. Um, so for those of you that weren't active in the hobby, back then, um, first off, there weren't that many games that were coming out compared to now. Um, I went a little sec. Let me just close this. Did a little bit of number crunching via Board Game Geek before I came on this. So in like 1977, for example, in Board Game Geek, there's about 150 games that are tagged as war games. In the recent years, 2021, 22, in that area, it's about 1,000 games a year that are war games out of about 5,000 that are published overall each year. Now, obviously, a lot of those, when I looked at them, I would not consider to be kind of classical war games, but still, um, just from a ratio standpoint, there's many, many more games now than there were back then, which in many people kind of consider the golden age. But one thing that when you look back at those older games, and is that there wasn't a huge amount of innovation in the 70s for the most part in the mechanics of them. There was, all of the SPI games, the highlight, the heyday of SPI. They had a pretty solid formula core set of rules. And even Avalon Hill, which kind of toyed with different things, for the most part, the basic CRT, the basic the hexes and the there was a certain vocabulary that was involved. And for better or for worse, um, that both served as sort of an easier entry point for players. Once you learn one of those games, you could learn a lot of other ones at the same time. But also, I think that over time through the 70s and the 80s, that the game started getting more and more Byzantine, more and more complicated because they just kind of built on each other. It was sort of like an echo chamber where the gamers wanted more complexity and more realism, and we could talk a lot more about realism and what that actually means in a simulation game. Um, and to the point where ultimately, I think the hobby just kind of collapsed on its own weight. The game started getting so complicated, and just more and more complex, and longer and longer, and weren't really breaking huge amounts of mechanical ground that, um, in the 80s and into the 90s, there was, obviously SPI folded up, and then Avalon Hill got sold, and the simulations industry kind of had to reinvent itself. Um, and that came from a lot of different places. Um, one of them, of course, is with Mark Herman's game We the People, with the first card-driven games. Even the seeds of it were in the 70s with things like Squad Leader, with more interaction between players. I remember playing games back in the 80s in college where you literally go out for like 3 or 4 hours and go and do something and then come back and your opponent would still be making their move, and kind of things that wouldn't fly. But um, people, and for those of you that weren't around back then, when games like We the People came out, when games like World in Flames came out, which um, tried to streamline a lot of these features, tried to make things a lot more interactive, there was a fairly big pushback from a lot of people in the wargaming field. There was a lot of people that said, "Oh, that they're not as realistic. They're not really simulations. They're kind of playing fast and loose with history." Um, but I think that over the years, intervening, um, as war simulation games have started to become much more popular again, into the 2010s and later and things like that, when you start seeing the resurgence of GMT and games like that, the thing that's kind of kept it fresh and has kept it growing has been the the openness, the adoption of different types of mechanisms and different mechanisms that are going to make it a lot um, simpler to, well, not different types of mechanisms that are more engaging for players. And a lot of that kind of borrows from, uh, I apologize. I'm staring at myself talking here, and it's kind of freaking me out. It's throwing me off here. Sorry. There, I can talk to you, Harold. It's better. Thank you. I appreciate it. Feel free to pin me on your own screen. Um, so, um, the my trajectory through wargaming was similar to a lot of people's through gaming, in that I was very big in war games in the 70s and the 80s, in the 90s. Then I got a family, I got married, I had a family, and I kind of dropped off on the wargaming, and I picked up on the Euro games, and I started playing, Catan, and we would import games from Germany and stuff like that. And I was amazed at the mechanics and the novelty of things that were available at that point. And so it took a little bit of time, but now we've kind of reached a point where all of those very creative mechanics that have driven the growth of Euro games and hobby games in general, to the point where it's like 5,000 games a year, and you've got so much more popular cultural penetration of gaming in general, have started to filter into the simulation game, the historical game field as well. Before this started, Alex was on, we're just talking about it, and he said, "Oh, it's bag building part of it," right? And that just like warmed my heart. It's like, okay, cool. And really, it goes way back. I mean, chit pull, the first chit pull game I recall would be Firepower, which I think was in the mid 80s, the Avalon Hill tactical game, where you had little guys running around and you threw a couple of chits in the cup for different and then you pulled them, and it's sort of a variable turn order. But it kind of came and it went. But now we see the embracing of it. And when a new mechanism comes up, it gets folded into the simulation field. I mean, so like when deck building came out, was first, very big in Euro games, right? But then, very quickly, Martin Wallace picked up deck building and turned it into A Few Acres of Snow, which was a very novel take on it, and gave a very interesting perspective on that conflict. And then ultimately it turned into David Thompson's Undaunted series, is one of the latest, very mature expression of deck building, or even his war chest for bag building, right? So you just see that kind of thing over and over again, where you see these different mechanisms that are kind of refined in one area and cross pollinate into the other. And I can tell you, for those of you that were around in gaming in the 80s, if something like um, A Few Acres of Snow or Undaunted had come out, it might have been popular. It come out in the 80s. It might have been popular, but I think that it probably would have been also kind of dismissed as not a serious game, which I think was really to the detriment of war games back then. Again, in the 80s, it was very self-serious. It was very much a study. But I think in retrospect, when you look at it, the things it was studying was not really accurately reflecting the reality of command, the reality of what you can learn out of a game. And one of the things that I think is fantastic now is that we're taking these mechanisms, and there's much more focus when you look at, you're talking about a Churchill, or my the game I'm doing with David Thompson, Chang'e, about the Chinese voyages, or Versailles 1919, that I did with Mark, is that we picked a very particular point of view. We didn't try to simulate every single detail. there's an authorial perspective that you're going to take on a game, and you say, this is what's important to me. And in games like even ASL, which I just love to death and played to death, I could spend a whole hour just talking about the Red Paragades campaign games that I played before I had kids. I could afford that to spend that kind of time. But that has a lot of Chrome, but it's Chrome in a certain direction, right? It tries to do everything, and by doing everything, sometimes it does nothing. And so that's one of the things I'm very enthusiastic about with the latest batch of simulation games, is that there's a definite perspective, there's a story that they're trying to tell, and they're selecting the right editorial tools to kind of express that. So the other big major theme is the big major theme that I'm excited about is theme. Back again, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was World War II, Civil War. It was those the big ones, the big topics that everyone used to do. There's much more variety of topics in simulation games, and also people are not afraid to tackle non-war topics. Back most of the year, look at the catalog for Avalon Hill and SPI, and while there were some outliers here and there that were not about a battle or a campaign or something, they were few and far between, and kind of treated as sort of the odd ducks in the lines. Okay, right now there's so many different takes on history that don't necessarily include war. I mean, like like the two games that I mentioned that I've been working on. So like Versailles 1919, about the negotiation of the treaty, was it's kind of war adjacent, but it's not conflict in the same fashion. But it gives people perspective to learn history. Or Founding Fathers. It's another one, right? Another kind of negotiation game. Or a bunch of the games that came out of the Zenobia Awards, which Harold started. There were some that were war games, but there was some that were looking at periods of history that had not really been examined, that didn't necessarily include battles. That was one of the things that attracted me to our Chang'e game, which is about the voyages of the Chinese treasure fleet in the 1400s through the Indian Ocean. There was occasional battles, but that wasn't the main part of it. It was about reestablishing the tribute system. It was about trade. It was about some level of exploration. So it was other factors that people could step into. So I think that there's so much unexplored territory. I'm sure somebody out there is working on another great Battle of the Bulge game, but I'm not sure if we really need it. But hey, more power to them if they can do a new perspective on it, or a new type of thing. But I'm enthusiastic for topic. I'm enthusiastic for mechanism. I'm just in general always been kind of bullish on gaming and the way that it goes. So it was a very long-winded answer to your question.
It's good stuff.
I'm sorry.
Jeff. It's interesting coming back from the Naval War College, and they have a civilian chief gamer, Peter Pellegrino, who you may have heard his name and know him. Was very, very interesting. But he talked about a couple of things that really hit us in the hobby, just like it hits them in their professional wargaming. The first is that that detail does not make accuracy. Right, that just providing detail in games and more detail does not make for a game that simulates anything. As a matter of fact, if we're simulating a battle between battleships and every real-time turn takes an hour, but we're actually fighting a battle that we're simulating 15 or 30 or 60 seconds of time. That it changes the mindset, right? And that there have been arguments that a lot of the wargaming that they did, trying to create all of that accuracy before World War II, meant that the U.S. lost some critical battles because the leaders thought they had time to plot and to think, and in reality, Salvo Island was resolved in an hour or two, right? And it was the bloodiest battle in American history, naval battle. And sometimes attributed to the fact that wargaming changed the way improperly that we think about it. The other interesting
Interesting.
thing is that they talked a little bit about engagement, right? So for us, a game needs to be fun and have some interesting history to it. That's what pulls all of us together. And from their perspective, games need to be engaging, because if people drift during the game, then it's not a very good exercise. So they're dealing with a lot of the same things we deal with as we talk about more or less detail and engagement.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I remember back when in the 90s when, computers were first coming online, in a bigger way in wargaming, right? I mean, wargaming was always, through the 80s and everything, it was always more detail, more detail, more detail, right? And if only we could, to Brooke, you had the angle that the shell was coming in at it versus the slope of the angle on the armor plates on your tanks, right? um and it was always like, if we could build that detail into our games, and we can do that now with a computer can handle all that. Computer can track of every single gun that we've got. And so there were games like that came out, like the Operational Art of War, and so maybe that was in the early 2000s. But I remember that, these games are coming out, and they ended up getting so detailed that no that people just tuned it out. It was just total overload. There was so much of a level of detail that in the end it was like, look, just give me some rough idea what happens if I attack from here into here. It's like I don't need I don't need to know exactly how many mortars they have in this and that and what the exact precise fatigue level is to two decimal places, right? I mean, the end, when people came into it, it's just, you didn't explore that, you didn't use it. There was only a certain level that you could come at. And I think that kind of being exposed to that sort of made designers sit up and recoil a little bit and take notice, and say, oh yeah, if we have infinite detail, it doesn't make it for a better game. It's a better game if you got a wooden block standing up on its side and you can just, rotate it to four different spots, right? That's um so it was almost like, the dog caught the car and then it didn't know what to do with it once it had it, and then it backed away. So I think, yeah, a lot of that driving for quote unquote realism and detail, people just realized ultimately was futile, just having the tools at their disposal to be able to make it happen.
yeah. Yeah. And, my personal bias is I prefer the balance toward fun. I think a game needs to be interesting, but at the same time, if it's not fun, it's not compelling to me. We were talking about Alex's game, Land and Freedom. And it's a beautiful mix of abstraction and fun. And, it's the kind of game I like to play now, which is different. I remember playing even the flight simulators. Wasn't there an Apache flight simulator that pilot said was more complex than actually flying the helicopter?
Yeah, sure. And it was harder to do. It was harder to fly it on the computer than it was. Yeah, some of the F-16 simulators, they came literally with notebook, 200-page note binders that you had to flip through to try to figure out how to work the radar system, which
Yeah.
is cool. But yeah, I mean, when you're flying, you want to do it. But it goes back to the oldest science fiction tropes. It's like, ultimately it's just computers will probably just be doing all this stuff. And yet, in all of the science fiction movies, it's always, somebody trying to aim with a joystick to try to, shoot something down.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And I think, the other important thing is that there's, to each their own, right? I mean, I think there's room for all sorts of games here. I don't want to argue that my view is the best or the
oh
correct.
yeah, oh, go ahead. You can argue that. Go for it.
Well,
Look, yeah, I mean, and everybody, and as a designer, you got to know that the game you're designing, there's going to be people that don't like it. You
right.
can't make a game that everyone is going to be happy, which is why you've got to take a point of view, right? If you try to just play a middle of the road and be all things to all people, whatever, it's not going to work, right? And you're going to get, different things for different people. You're going to approach at different times, right? So if I'm playing Memoir 44, I'm not playing Memoir 44 to learn that much about the history of, D-Day or whatever, right? I mean, it's not at that level that you're getting stuff out. So, if I'm really interested in learning about a topic, there's certain types of games I'll play or certain things we'll look at. So yeah, I think everyone's got to kind of know their self and what they're looking for. But with 1,000 new war games coming out every year, just, there's plenty of stuff for different people.
Plenty, for sure. What about conventions? You attend a number of big conventions over the course of the year. What do you see changing there?
Um, well, Gen Con was absolutely crazy this year. I was just there a couple of weeks ago. Um, it's it's a little different for me because I have a very personal, I have maybe a particularly different personal take on cons that I go to is I spend not too much time actually playing games at conventions for the most part. Um, I I go to the major, general gaming cons, and I try to go to some local cons. One of these years I'm going to get out to one of the SD Hist cons. But I mean, for me now, when I go to conventions, I'm looking to it's a social thing for me to see people that I haven't gotten to see in a long time. There's some people that I really just see at Gen Con or just see at conventions and really just get to see once or twice a year. So I go and seek those people out. And if I go and I play, if I go off and I'm going to play a 4 or 5 hour game of something, then it's not that takes a lot of time out of my, just a 2 or 3 day time that I'm there when I want to get out and see people. So I don't do that much anymore. Sometimes I will do it. Last year I was at the Gathering of Friends, which is a much more kind of relaxed, and it's like a week and a half long kind of convention. I wasn't there for the whole time, but I was there long enough that I actually was able to take a day out and spend and play Civilization with a group of 7 hardy souls, which it's been a while since that happened. So, and I got to play Crete, which I always enjoy. Um, so that was fun. So, that's another fun thing is, you kind of get to do sometimes you take time to do those mega things. But for me now, it's mainly about the social stuff. Um, and so conventions are for me to, take advantage of that. I also like to check out when I go to conventions to try to see some obscure games or things that to that discovery. I love that part of it of just finding stuff. And that's one of yeah, as I mentioned, the first con I went to was in 78, 79. And for most of the conventions I went to, up until, the last 10 years is you really had no idea what was going to be there. It was very, it's a lot of really small publishers. I mentioned Junta was the original white box Junta. I just met the designer was one guy behind a card table. Have you played Junta, Harold? Have you played that? That's I love that game so much. I have so many stories, and that's another thing is games that make stories. Junta makes stories that you can tell for decades after. Um, but back then there was you every booth there was something surprising and something different, and you would discover a lot of stuff. And the production values were not as important in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is one thing I think we've kind of lost. I'd love to get back to that. Back then you had Ziploc bag games. You had stuff where you had to cut out the cards yourself when you got home, whether to take out a pair of scissors or whatever and cut them out. Even in the 2000s, there was a company called Cheap Ass Games. James Ernest, who's done a lot of really terrific stuff. But he used to just bang out just tons of games, and they were very mixed quality. But some of them were really exceptional. But the way they worked is, I had a subscription program where I just, sent them $20 every once in a while, and then games would just show up in my mailbox in an envelope. And same thing, you'd have to provide your own money, your own chips, your own dice. But he gave you the cards and the rules and everything just in an envelope, and you used to just kind of go from there. And that there's a lot of that feeling now in RPGs. The RPG space feels very independent and very homebrew, and there's a lot of you can just get PDFs on drive through PDF. And I know that there's some war games. There's drive through war games, I think is actually what it's called. I mean, there are ways to get that in PvP games, but I think a lot of that has really been lost, and especially war game. Gamers in general are so obsessed with its and the appearance and the aesthetics of it, which I think can be important, but I think it's to the detriment of a lot of the creativity and stuff like that. So that's one thing that I have kind of missed from cons is that discovery. just because they're bigger companies now, and also the media saturation is just so huge. You know exactly what's coming out when you go to a Gen Con. People have a list. I'm going to go to this booth and this booth and this booth and get this and this and this, and know exactly what's happening. And it's just not as much fun as it used to be. One thing that I have seen, which is fantastic, is just there's way more diversity, both gender and ethnicity of people that are at, these places. I mean, when I went to the first Origins, it was, it was almost exclusively male. And now when you go to a Gen Con, it's very, very mixed, a huge variety of ways, which is great. And I think also, informs a lot of different approaches to the games and the subject matter themselves, not just, not just the people that you get to play with.
Yeah, agreed. I'm going to ask if there are any questions for Geoff. Feel free to either raise your hand or there's a comment from Mark. Mark, do you want to verbalize that, or should we read it?
Sure, I can go ahead and give that a shot. I guess.
Yeah, please.
So, hi, Geoff. So I just wrote it in the chat there, but I love the idea of history games, what you were kind of talking about. And I think it was probably Harold I heard use the term before, non-kinetic conflicts. And so, I mean, so subjects that are about, that still do kind of a model or a simulation, lowercase s simulation. I don't want to get too highfalutin about the word simulation, but they're modeling something that's real world history, but not military in nature. And so I cited Votes for Women as an example that I love.
Sure.
Recent, and I hope there's more and more of these things. But I wonder sometimes, when I talk to my Eurogame friends, they're not so interested in that much history. And when I talk to my wargame friends, they're not necessarily so interested in that much non-military stuff. And I wonder if this is kind of a niche of a niche. And since I'm not trying to publish these games and make a living at it, I'm not too worried if the market's that small, other than I hope that there's enough of them out there for me. What do you think?
I think it's a fair question about where these are going to go, but I think there's a lot of ways to. I mean, simulation kind of spans a broad expanse of stuff. I mean, so for me, it's for simulation, you could say it's it has a model, and from that, I kind of think of it almost like a state machine kind of a thing, where it's you plug in the inputs and you get your some version of history or events or something on the other side. But I mean, the educational side of it, I mean, I've argued, debated, posted my opinion sometimes of like, what is a war game, right? And I feel like there's no good definition. It's a fuzzy thing. There's a sliding scale. But for me, with those games, when I sit down for a simulation game, I'm looking to learn something, right? I'm looking to take something away from the game, or at least have the possibility to learn something. Maybe it's something I knew already, but just learn something or get a little bit of a feel for what it was like to go through that, or get a different perspective on the events in question. So that can take a couple of different ways. I mean, you could make an argument that says that like Wingspan, is going to teach you something about birds and the different families of birds and the types of birds. I wouldn't call that a simulation in any way, shape, or form, but I think it starts to dip its toe into getting people involved in simulations. But yeah, I mean, I think that I'm trying to think. I mean, there have certainly been some games that I would say are more on the on the Euro gamer type side, that not the war gamer type side, that have explored that. I think you've got Freedom Underground Railroad as an example of one that I think has crossed over pretty well. And I know that Oli's done very well with that game. And I'm trying to think of.
Well, Tory Brown has Votes for Women, right? Which is
right. Well, Votes for Women was mentioned, or yeah. Yep. And I think that's, just when you look in terms of how well it's doing, I don't know how well it's selling. But I think that on the positive side, also, I think that there has been some pushback against games that just sort of adopt these themes but don't really engage with them. Um, which I think will start to force designers to, not just take the easy way out and just, name it after something what it is, but actually really engage with that theme and the history that they're trying to tell. There was recently, just a couple weeks ago, there was Shut Up and Sit Down did a review of the game Golem, which took its inspiration from a story about, Jewish population in Prague. I think it was in Prague. In Prague, defending themselves against some pogroms and anti-Semitic attacks and things like that. And it just used it as window dressing, right? It's a really interesting topic, and it's, a non-military topic, although there was, fighting and stuff, but it's, but it wasn't really engaged with in the way, and they kind of, rightly so, in my opinion, kind of went after the game and said, look, you're using this as window dressing. If you're going to deal with these themes, if you're going to do this kind of stuff of take pages out of history, do something with it. Yeah, I see somebody just mentioned Watergate. Alex just mentioned Watergate in the chat, right? So that's, yeah, Watergate's another one that has actually done really well as a 2-player game. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis one, 13 Days. I think also is another one that's kind of almost war, not quite war. So I think there's plenty of things like that. There's a lot of simulations of the space race, I think would be another example. And it's interesting to look at those because there's also different versions of those in terms of how accurate they try to get in terms of, simulating the history. So I think we're just at the beginning stages of this. So I think there will be, I don't think there's been a super duper breakout hit of that maybe yet, but I think that it's just around the corner. I think that there's going to be some game that's going to be as big as a Wingspan or as a Gloomhaven or something like that. That's going to be kind of in the simulation space that's non-military. I don't think we've seen it yet, but I think there's definitely possibilities for it.
Geoff, some would argue that Twilight Struggle has fit the bill there, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And I think, yeah, I was almost mentioned that one, but it's got Cold War. I mean, war is right there in the title, but yeah, I mean, it was not. It's not a war game the way we think of it as a war game.
The way some, right? I mean, I don't really want to get into the definitions, but the war game definition is intensely personal. So some would say it is, some would say it isn't. I say it is. There are 2 counters in the game that have tanks on them, so it has to be a war game.
There you go.
Yeah, so it's resolved. Let's move to the next argument. Yeah, I think I think that as we start to argue for a broader definition of, I would argue for war game, but historical historical games, historical or conflict simulations, or broader definitions, at least, we are going to run into that space where we say, well, it's history, but there's really no history there, right?
Right.
Whether it's Bruges, right? The Canal game, it's full of history, but there's no history there, right?
I mean, even when we were designing Chang'e, when before I kind of started with that, I looked at the other space. I looked at other games and there have been other games that use that theme, but none of them really. It's all abstracted.
Yeah.
It's really abstracted, and you're not going to learn anything about it except maybe the names of some of the cities they visited. That's it, right? So, I felt that we had something to say that was going to be different than what had been out there.
Right.
So yeah.
Dennis, did you raise your hand there?
Yes, a couple of questions there. You say, putting out 1,000 publications a year on war games. Do you think, there could be a possibility of a saturation of the market? There's just too many out there. And these conventions that you go to, is the war. I look at the people that go to these, and they're, for the most part, up in our age bracket. is there a younger cadre of war gamers coming up, and at these conventions, are they getting bigger? And it sounds too like the games that are being played are more diverse. They're branching out from your traditional war games into the Euro games or some of these other non-war game subjects that have an historical content to it.
So first, the saturation question. I think, yeah, I think that the gaming industry to a certain extent is kind of due for a bit of a reckoning. I don't think that 5,000 new, and this is not just historical games, right? This is everybody, right? I don't think that 5,000 new games is sustainable. And a lot of those are coming from Kickstarter. A lot of those are just kind of individual people that just pop up and, decide they're going to make a game. So who knows how many they're selling. But as a designer, it's super scary, market out there. I've come out with games that just came out and they were like, people talked about them for a week and then they just vanished, right? It's just, there's so many new games that are coming out that it's very, very difficult to get noticed. And that was one of the things that, when I teach my game design classes and I talk to the students or people come to me for advice on their pitch, right? It's like, what's going to make your game stand out among those 5,000? And you got to have something. And it's not an easy question. There's not always a good answer for it. Although if you don't have a good answer, that's a sign that maybe you're not supposed to be making that game. Maybe the world doesn't need another one of those. There's already plenty. But I think that I would not be surprised over the next 3 to 5 years if we saw a pretty big contraction in the number of publishers that there are. And consequently the number of new games that come out. There's a few larger companies. You've got Asmodee, you've got Hasbro, which owns Wizards of the Coast, of course. But below that level, there's a lot of mid-sized companies that are not nearly as big as people think they are. Okay. Like my daughter, those who don't know, my daughter works for Indie Boards and Cards. So she's a game developer. And so she works on Aeon's Endline, and she just did the new Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition game. And so she's doing a great job over there. And I'm guessing, I'm curious about how many of you have heard of Indie Boards and Cards. They do the Resistance and Coup and games like that. But they're considered to be a fairly sizable player in the market. Their company they're 7 people. Right? That's the whole company. I don't know how many GMT is. I would guess it's probably not many more than that kind of full-time employees. I don't know if any of you have any insight into how many full-time employees they have, but most of these companies are going in, and really to kind of stay in business on a long-term basis, they need to have an evergreen title. They need to have something that keeps them going. So they can make some mistakes and not crash and burn. And for Indie Boards and Cards, that those games now are Terraforming Mars and the Resistance and Coup are kind of their 3 big titles that kind of keep them going. GMT had Twilight Struggle for a while, and then they of course adopted their P500 to try to keep things a little bit more even keeled. But if you don't have that title that year in and year out, it's very hard to just keep making a new games, and you need at least one to do okay to kind of keep you going for the next year. So I think that reckoning is going to come. Of course, I've also been predicting that Kickstarter is going to go, that people are going to wise up and stop using Kickstarter for like the last 10 years, and I've been wrong over and over and over and over again. So take everything I say with a grain of salt on that. In terms of the demographics, I think that while the old line, maybe, hex and counter type war games are not, don't have, maybe are graying to a certain extent, or I think that there's a plenty of fresh people that are coming in and are coming into, less complex games like an Undaunted series. There's also a lot of people still in the miniatures spaces, which is still, doing popular. And so a lot of people consider war games and kind of getting in from that end. So I think there's definitely you know, a younger crowd that's coming in, that are starting to pick up the mantle of these games and find them interesting and want to do them. So I don't have any specific demographic data, but just in terms of me seeing people playing and interested and looking at sales figures for games, there's plenty of interest in these types of games. Maybe those people aren't going to the WBC or things like that, but I think they're still out there for sure.
Yeah, that's to me one of the most exciting things is the shift in demographics and interest in the hobby, certainly amongst historical gaming. And I think it means that the hobby, the historical gaming hobby, will survive in some fashion. But it's exciting. A card
But
bar,
I think that that helps expand it also, just because the topics, the different topics expands it. You may not be interested in World War II, but you may be interested in exploration, or you may be interested in Arctic, the voyage and the endurance in the Arctic or whatever, right? I mean, there's some story, the more stories, different stories we're telling, the more different types of people we'll bring in.
Yeah, and it's chicken and egg, but both are working in our favor. I think that the designers come from gamers. So as we have a more diverse group of gamers coming in, we'll see a more diverse group of designs for certain. And the Zenobia Award kind of showed us that. Akar Bharadwaj asked a question. By the way, the newest board member of the SD Hist group. You mentioned a time when complexity overwhelmed wargaming in the 80s. Where do you see the future of complexity in historical gaming?
I think it's really interesting. Lately I've kind of seen a bifurcation to a big extent in the gaming market in general, to either really simple games and much more complicated games, with the middle kind of getting hollowed out in a weird way. There's games that, again, I guess this is why I don't put any money on any of my prognostications, but I see games like Kingdom Death, and there's even like Foundations of Rome, that are super expensive, or just very, very time consuming, or just like kind of lifestyle games that you have to invest in. And those seem to be doing, a lot of those are doing really well. These super big, complicated, even like Frosthaven, where it's you can take it in bite-sized chunks, but that's 1,000 hours to play, right? I mean, that's like Empires and Arms or any of these other games that we used to, where you could play a couple of turns and whatever. So there's definitely still an appetite for that complexity, but I think a lot of it is that the mechanics are, the rule books are still shorter than they used to be, right? The complexity kind of arises from a different place. It doesn't come from rules, it comes from execution. And I think that's one of the lessons that was learned, is that nobody wants to read a 100-page rule book. But on the other hand, I go back to, like, if you had video rules, if you had, people like, Rodney Smith doing how to play videos about coin games in the 1980s, I think that could have changed everything, right? That's a whole different way of learning, and it's a whole lot easier for people to just jump on and to see that, as opposed to having to wade through a 100-page rule book. So I think there's still an opportunity for complexity, but I don't think it's going to be like it used to be. I can't see somebody coming out with a game now like an Advanced Squad Leader or a Starfleet Battles that literally have binders full of pages of rules.
So anybody else have a question they want to verbalize?
Or a counterpoint. I mean, I'm happy if somebody comes in and has a counterpoint to what I'm saying. This doesn't just need to be a question for me. Go for it.
Who's going to argue with you?
Oh, I should introduce you to my family.
Well, I'll do a counterpoint for the sake of devil's advocate.
Go on.
So, my mind, you made a comment about role-playing games, and a lot of the vibrancy in role-playing game community right now is in stuff like the OSR, so the old school Renaissance, and you see a lot of like really fascinating stuff come out. But when that stuff comes out, it's 8 pages of rules, 20 pages of rules, and they're super creative and really interesting things. But if you look at now 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, if you add up the player's handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, it's probably like 1,000 pages of rules. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like
Yeah.
try to to have a new player come into that and trying to understand how all those rules work. I mean, that's probably more complicated. I haven't played Advanced Squad Leader, but I'm imagining it's more complicated than that.
The way you win Advanced
So,
Squad Leader is being able to figure out the rule you need to save you from whatever situation you're in. There's a
well,
rule in the rule book somewhere that will save you. You just need to figure out what it is.
I
I'm
mean,
sure
well,
D&D is the same way.
yeah, 5th edition D&D is the same way. But you know what? One of the things is that Dungeons and Dragons is having kind of like this renaissance moment now. Not even just with OSR, but like look at the movie came out, and it's sort of, despite the rules and complexity, it's having its moment. And
Is the complexity? I have not played D&D in many, many years, so I apologize for my ignorance about this. But is the complexity coming from like the volume of content in terms of like the number of different items and the number of different spells and the number of different monsters, right? That you just kind of have to understand how what they all are interact, or but the rules underlying them are all pretty straightforward, or is it that there's just a lot of other rule systems and different systems like psionics or whatever are getting plugged in?
so I'm not an expert in this, but like in the old school D&D, you had like you know 4 races and classes, and that was it. That was your build. You had like 50 pieces of equipment you could buy.
Yeah.
Now you've got a dozen different races you can pick, and probably like 2 dozen classes, and each class has like 3 different paths that you can take, and there's all these feats that you can buy and skills. And people try to min max, like, oh, I'm gonna build this wizard so it can do the most damage per round. And there is increased complexity along with the size. But yeah, so I don't know. So I don't know that I necessarily believe this, but to be devil's advocate, I think that
Yeah.
there could be super complicated war games in the future that could um
But I think maybe comparable to D&D in that sense of just having a lot of different things and different paths you can go down. I would look at, say, Magic the Gathering, right? Magic the Gathering, the rule set is kind of basic, but the interactions between things is probably, of all the clarifications and everything, that's probably encyclopedia in and of itself. But I think the advantages with like a Magic is that the rules are distributed between all of the components. There's not like one place where every card is listed that you gotta look it up. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right that there's probably there's definitely 100% a appetite for complexity due to content level complexity of all of those different feats and spells and things like that. But I'm not sure about the underlying rules about how complex those get to actually apply them in the end.
Sometimes, there are just a lot of different types of people out there, right? That
Yeah.
like different things.
Sure.
And I think there are some people that just like to read new monster manuals, right? And they spend time with that. For me, it was, Panzer Leader in the late 70s. There was a playbook that came with that had a discussion of the different units and how many men and what kind of tanks and guns, and it was awesome. And I spent hours just looking at that, not playing the game, just reading the player handbook. But Geoff, let me close out by asking you one last question. And the question is, what can we all do as gamers to continue the good momentum that we're seeing in historical games?
Um, I would definitely seek out the novel games, seek out, the games that are trying to do different things and to support those, particularly if they're coming from small publishers or independent publishers. Um, I think there's a lot of fertility in that area and a lot of exciting stuff that's being done. But sometimes you got to do a little bit of legwork to try to find that stuff. And I also think it's fine to, I mean, if you're in a regular, non-wargaming game group or whatever, if you're, you get together to play, Catan or Wingspan or whatever, that you can introduce people to, some gentler type war games. I've done groups of Eurogamers where I've had them play Republic of Rome, which is another like not really war game. Or like my friend so I've done that with a lot of different types of groups and things like that. And people will surprise you, but you don't want to like bring them into the deep end, right? You gotta. I hear horror stories, about some people that that do that, and it can more often than not spectacularly backfire. I will end then with my trial by fire story. This is my introduction to wargaming, which I probably should have opened with. So of things not to do. So when I was um probably like 12 or something like that, 11 or 12 years old, I went to sleepaway camp one year, and so it's like a 4-week camp in the woods in the hills of Pennsylvania, just the classic summer camp. And I got the reputation as like being the smart kid in the bunk, which was I was fine with, because the reputation I should have had was the kid that could not throw or catch anything. But so one day a kid walks in from a year older than us, from another bunk. He comes and he says, "Hey, I hear that you're smart. Here's a game. Let's play tomorrow." And he throws it on my bed and walks out. And I look at it, and I did not remember it at the time, but I realized years later that it was Panzerblitz. And I start reading this thing, and it's got all the symbols for like the mortars, and I didn't know what a half track was. I was 11. What do I? And so I'm reading this thing, and I'm trying. And he comes back the next day, and we play. We set up the pieces, and I'm playing, and I get absolutely destroyed. He just crushes me, and then he takes his game and he says, "Well," he says, "I guess you're not so smart." And then he packs it up and walks out. Now, a smarter person than me probably would have just said, "Well, I'm never, what do I need this for? I'm never going to play these again." Except for me, I was like, okay, I need to figure out what this is all about, and what it was. And so, um, and so when I got home, did, I found an Avalon Hill catalog somewhere. I think somebody had a copy of Acquire. I think my aunt and uncle had a copy of Acquire, and in that there was the catalog, and that was how I ended up with Rick Coffin's War, and I was going off to the races. But I tell that story to say, don't do that to people. Don't take them. And if you're gonna, cooperate, that's why cooperative games can be really good for that kind of thing, is to bring people along. Is there's you don't want to baby people, but there's steps to do it. And the other thing is that, people that are interested in the topic at hand, that's going to carry them a huge way towards learning a game and being into it if they engage with the topic. Now, the way to explain a game to somebody at the same camp, it may have even been the same year, certainly within a year of this, but I was just talking to this other kid, and he starts telling me about this game he was playing, which turned out to be Dungeons and Dragons. But he tells me about the game by telling me the adventures and the stories that they went on and what he was doing. And he did this, and they fought the dragon, and then they did this, and they swung around. I mean, all the hackneyed stories that you get out of D&D, especially in the 70s. And I was like amazed that a game could do that, right? I talked about before that, think about the story that you want your game to tell when you're designing a game. In D&D, he didn't tell me about, you had D20 with advantage, and you did this, and this was the modifier, and you had a +3 sort of whatever, right? He told a story, and he said, this game makes you do those stories, right? So that's the way that you want to approach games, and that's the way you want to get people to engage with these simulations, is in a way that's going to teach them. You talked about engage them and leave them with stories that they can tell to other people.
Yeah, very well done. Thank you, Geoff, for taking the time to meet with us. We hope to see you in San Diego or at another SD Hist event at some point.
Yes, I was hoping to come out to this one, but it's just I have a very busy fall, unfortunately, and the date didn't work for me. But I do appreciate the invite, and I look forward to coming out there and meeting all of you.
Good.
And if you're ever in New Jersey, drop me a line.
So which part of New Jersey? Yeah, you live over
So
there.
I'm in lovely Bridgewater, New Jersey. I got 2,500 games in my basement, so we can pull anything out.
Is there room to play games in the basement, or is it just?
Yeah, we got it. It's all good. It's all good. The tables drop from the ceiling. It's beautiful.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and good to see everybody. There'll be more of these to follow.